Vacy, thank you for that detailed analysis. I felt I was on a sort of analyst's couch wondering, which box might be ticked and whether I'd finish up as an appalling psychopath. Anyway, I'm going to ask for a plea in mitigation. One of the reasons we put this topic on tonight is because cruelty is frequently the consequence of policies. But if you look at the past 20 years of commentaries and textbooks about policy, you will never see the word cruelty in the index. It's as though it doesn't exist. So I'm concerned about two things. Not only is cruelty a consequence, but it also, in many instances, and I think Vacy has identified some of them, it's a motivating force for the people who actually craft the policies. Now, in order to avoid being accused of being fraudulent, given that tonight's topic refers to cruelty as policy, Australia, Saudi Arabia, the USA, and Israel, I'm going to give a few examples from those four countries, a bit of an overlap with Vacy. Then I'm going to speculate on the causes, a few additions, I think, from what Vacy said. But then, most of all, I want to concentrate on why cruelty becomes a motivating force in crafting policies all over the place, all over the world. You start off with Australia, you'd have to think that the stolen generation and the bestial treatment of children transferred here to live in institutions after the Second World War were examples of appalling cruelty. If you weren't convinced by that, you'd have to say that the way we've treated people on Manus Island and Nauru was not only an abuse of international law, but appalling cruelty. And if you didn't believe that, you'd have to say that the evidence was confirmed by Dutton's latest decree to deny asylum seekers any financial or housing assistance so that they either face homelessness here or more harm in offshore detention. And if we jump from them to one of our bosom friends, Saudi Arabia, which is a sort of Machiavellian regime, if ever there was one. Do you remember Machiavelli's principle that it was better to be feared than to be loved? And in the interest... Okay. And in that, according to that principle, they have a range of the most bestial forms of punishment you can imagine. You only have to look at the treatment of the blogger Raif Badawi, who wrote the website Free Saudi Liberals, in a piece of important advocacy of freedom of speech. For that, he was hauled out, sentenced to 1,000 lashes and 10 years imprisonment. This is he's been given 50 lashes, and then doctors are arguing about whether he's strong enough to receive any more. This is a country which has been lauded by the United States, by the United Kingdom, and in our Australian compliance with anything that the old mother country and the new fatherland say, we go along with it. We go along with that cruelty. This is a country which indulges in massive discrimination against women, forbids public meetings, and forbids any association with human rights organizations, Saudi Arabia. We jump to the USA, who have maintained the Guantanamo Gulag, who are determined to deny 26 million people any vestige of medical help, if medical insurance coverage, if Obamacare is abolished. They have a group of operatives there since Trump decided that he would have all the alleged illegal migrants rounded up and deported, a group of people called ICE agents. You may think that's to do with drugs, but it's not. They are the Immigration Customs Enforcement Officers. And there is strong evidence of a cruelty competition among them to see how many alleged illegal migrants they can round up. almost under, it's a bit like the story. I'm never quite sure how true it is that the cops on different motorways are there to try to accumulate as many speedsters as possible as a form of occupational reward. So here's the United States. Fascination with cruelty. I'll come back to them in a minute. And the other country was Israel, and I think Vacy has dealt with that in some detail. You only have to think of 50 years of occupation into the 11th year of the appallingly cruel siege of Gaza. And I'm looking right at the camera at the moment, because it's about time that every politician in Canberra, there's some brilliant exceptions among the Greens and a couple of Labour people, had the courage to say, we are not going to put up with this cruelty any longer. You only have to look at the appalling combination, not just of Israel, but also of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, to ensure that only at the most 2 hours of electricity was available to the people of Gaza. I have a close friend whom I brought out of Gaza, Samia Elwan, a wonderful young woman. She lives in the Western Australia now. She went home to see her mother, who was dying. At the Allenby Bridge, the Israelis confiscated all the papers of the 2-year-old because he was not born in Israel, It took me about a month to get her, she was then stopped, took me a month to get her out, to get her back, with the help of a couple of diplomats. This lady died last week, and Samia wrote to me, at least my mother will no longer suffer pain. She will no longer have to queue at military checkpoints. She will no longer have to seek permission to leave or return to her own country. Now, if that's not an example of appalling, cultivated, well-honed, well-practiced cruelty, I don't know what is. And I hope, because Liam's a good cameraman, that this YouTube goes to all the cowardly politicians in Canberra. Look, we could go, the cruelty is infinite. We only have to think today of what the Myanmar regime is dishing out to the Rohingya people. I want to give a couple of, we've dealt mostly with regimes, although in the analysis of psychopathy, of psychopaths, Vacy has looked at individual behavior. I want to give 2 examples before we transfer into the question why and how. On the death of Julia Gillard's father, the well-known toxic shock jock, Alan Jones, said that her father died of shame. What possesses a human being to behave in that manner, even if they always have a microphone to their mouth? And the second similar example of appalling cruelty occurred when the Palestinian prisoners 6 months ago went on strike to protest for better conditions in the prisons, at least for modest visiting rights. And on the second day of their hunger strike, settlers arrived to organize a raucous barbecue outside the prison. Okay, so interdependence between individual behavior and that which goes on in institutions. Let me transfer now to a quick sort of radar sweep of why the cruelty. I don't completely understand Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, although it's very important as one set of explanations, admittedly prompted by her observations of the trial of Adolf Eichmann. But what I understand is partly about psychopathic behavior, but more that there's a kind of, the essence of psychopathy is that you don't have any moral, you don't have any conscience, you're not too bothered. It enters into your taken for granted DNA in a particular culture. It's banal, it's trite. We can raise questions as to the extent to which we accept that it goes on here. The second explanation related to that, which which I think is more common in this country and others, is what the wonderful Czech playwright and former president and the craftsman of the Velvet Revolution, Václav Havel, called automaticity. In other words, in bureaucracies, people are concerned to preserve themselves from chaos. So they let the cogs in the wheel keep turning. And it occurred to me today when I received a letter from the Department of Immigration saying that the family, the parents of a Palestinian who's here, and I'd dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and given the financial guarantees that they could come here for a 2-week holiday to visit their son. And the letter says, no, you can't. We don't trust them. How do we know they wouldn't go back? So it occurred to me as I read this piece of Cruelty that here was a kind of automatically well-oiled response within a bureaucracy. I'm not saying that the people, when we refer to the Department of Border Protection or whatever it's called, that people are accepting the cruelty. I think they have a capacity for thinking, but the commitment to keeping the bureaucracy ticking over, watch out for it, is so great that it has almost a terrible cultural momentum behind it that won't stop. But the third explanation for me has to do with sadism, frankly, where there's enormous pleasure derived from being cruel to another human being, and you've mentioned that. You'd only have to look at the bestiality in institutions to think that people who've been victims desperately want to avoid being victims. They desperately want to almost obtain what looks to me like some kind of sexual pleasure in being monstrously cruel to some other people. How else do I explain that in Indonesia a couple of weeks ago, they haul out young women to flog in public for being too close to their boyfriends? I know it's allegedly justified by Sharia law, and the crowd is expected to cheer. Right? Nobody talks about that. We welcome their politicians. We say they're another set of bosom friends up the road. Okay, so well, let's leave the psychologistic efforts to explain. Let me transfer to what I think is the meat of the issue in policy terms. Why does this cruelty how and where does it get transferred into policy? The first example is what I would call the absolutist or the direct, where it's pretty obvious, it's pretty uncontroversial that governments are quite happy to impose cruelty. The Saudis knew they were sentencing Raif Badawi to that kind of flogging. The Australian government knows that they're paying a fortune to have people imprisoned on Manus Island and in Nauru. So there's one explanation there. It's direct. It's almost unashamed and unapologetic, even though in Australia we try to conceal it and still pretend that we're all mates. The second explanation in my mind about the question how cruelty gets transferred into policy is what I would call enabling, where the policy is enabling in the sense that it's more an act of omission than commission. If you think of cruelty to animals, and we ought to include that because I think the line between cruelty to animals and cruelty to human beings is pretty blurred. We only get to throw up our hands in horror when we get evidence that cattle have been bludgeoned to death with sledgehammers in a Vietnamese abattoir. Or a bit later that they've had their legs tied and their throats cut in Indonesian abattoirs. And suddenly, but the willingness to do nothing about it has enabled, arguably, that cruelty to occur. There's a third way in which cruelty enters policy, and that's by deception, where the politicians and the public servants and their media acolytes somehow deceive themselves that we are, all the while we're being cruel, we're actually being massive observers of Christian values of loving kindness and generosity. So if you look at Scott Morrison's maiden speech, it was all about the Sermon on the Mount, even as he was the architect of the turning back the boats and being the strong man in terms of the maltreatment of refugees. If you look at the inscription at the base of the Statue of Liberty, as you enter New York Harbor, it says, I think, give me your poor, your troubled, your huddled masses who are yearning to breathe free. You think, wow, that must mean the land of the free. And yet, Guantanamo, infinite wars, infinite use of killing innocent people, roundup of anybody who looks as though they're from the Middle East, even though the Oklahoma bomber was one of our boys. So there's this massive policy has become part of a massive deception. So we're now imposing certain rules about drug testing, not of politicians, but of people on allegedly on welfare, as a form of benevolence. And the final explanation in my terms about cruelty policy relationship is what I would call collusion. We happily collude with countries who practice cruelty. We say that we'll cooperate with the Saudis and the Americans who've imposed this who've created this appalling famine in Yemen, and the consequent, one of the greatest outbreaks of cholera since the Second World War. We collude with the Israelis. Netanyahu arrives here in February, and Prime Minister Turnbull poured treacle all over him. He said that we were the same. If you examine his speech, we're the same countries. That he's going to go shortly to Israel to celebrate the Battle of Beersheba, where the Australian 4th Light Horse Brigade, you can tell I'm not a military man, can't you? Beat the hell out of the Ottoman Turks, and that apparently, according to Turnbull, led to the creation of the State of Israel. So that and Mary disagrees with that, thank you. So that and the Balfour Declaration, which is one of the most misrepresented, distorted documents in history. So the arguments about deception as cruelty, I think, are convincing. Let me turn now to the optimistic bit, which is a finish. Well, how do we respond? I'm trying to argue essentially that cruelty is a major issue in the crafting and the consequences of domestic and foreign policies. And in order to maintain our cultural image in this and other countries, we've denied that it occurs. The first point to make is that we have to rely on the fourth estate, on the media, mainstream, social media, to expose what goes on. If you remember the work of the wonderful American reporter Seymour Hersh, investigative reporter for the New Yorker, who told us about, with help from others, about Abu Ghraib, about the torture that went on in Abu Ghraib. I think we also ought to pay tribute to WikiLeaks, who exposed so much of the massive fraud that's gone on in the name of governments who claim to be only in the interests of humanity. The second thing I'd say is that we desperately need to have a much tighter, much more effective human rights legislation and abide by it. There is an international covenant There is an international covenant against torture and inhumane punishment, but you'd think it never existed. Australia is the only democratic, so-called liberal country in the West that does not have a human rights treaty. In consequence, and I've pinched this evidence from George Williams, the impressive constitutional lawyer from UNSW, the High Court has made rulings that are manifestly cruel. Not so long ago, it ruled that children could be held in detention, could be imprisoned, that asylum children could be imprisoned. It's a High Court ruling. It has also ruled that people could be detained indefinitely, forever and ever. Thirdly, I think we need to be much more fascinated with the opposite of cruelty, which in my book has to be about the philosophy and the language and the practice of non-violence. There's a massive illiteracy in Canberra and elsewhere about non-violence, which Mahatma Gandhi told us was not just a way of living, but a law for life, he said. And the last but one point that I'll make is that we really have to regard cruelty not as some sort of awful topic to not to want to hear about, as though it's only done by psychopaths or by people who are not like us. I'm arguing, I think, that it is done by people who are like us. I remember going to Cambodia after the Pol Pot genocide for the UN to conduct a small inquiry, spitting into the wind, it was really like. But this was about very normal people who had perpetrated appalling things against their neighbors. And you saw that in the terrible Rwanda genocide as well. Let me finish up with referring to the world of theatre, of music, of great literature and poetry, because great composers, great novelists, great poets have always dealt with this problem, because their vision has usually been about the alternative to cruelty. I haven't mentioned Russia. Nobody's mentioned Russia. And if you look at the Stalinist purges and look at what people had to tolerate, you'd have to say there was almost endemic cruelty, well developed. And in the career and life of Boris Pasternak, famous poet, famous author of Dr. Zhivago, if you haven't read the book, you'll remember Julie Christie and Omar Sharif, I'm sure. He never knew when he was going to be arrested. He talks about the permanent state of fear that was with his tongue in his cheek, was a quality of life. And he was awarded, of course, the Nobel Prize for Literature, but he was not allowed and he could not go to receive it. And on the occasion of the award, he wrote a poem called The Nobel Prize, and it finishes up with this response to cruelty. And he says, and this is about maintaining our optimism and a kind of determination to win out. Even so, with one of my feet in the grave, I still believe that cruelty, spite, the forces of darkness will in time be crushed by the spirit of light. That's what he said, and I think that's where I should finish.